The year was 1983. Greece, still marked by the deep transformations that followed the fall of its military dictatorship, was entering a period of cultural rebirth. Among ancient ruins and landscapes that seemed suspended in time, archaeologists, scholars, and wanderers searched tirelessly for fragments of forgotten glory. And it was within this setting, a land where myth and history blended seamlessly, that an event unfolded which would shake the very notion of memory, childhood, and the unexplained. The town of Delphi, resting between sacred mountains that once echoed with oracles and the whispers of gods, was alive that summer, with visitors walking among the remnants of the great temple of Apollo. But what no one expected was that the most astonishing discovery would not come from professors or seasoned researchers. It would come from the lips of a child. A family from Athens had brought their 5-year-old son to explore the archaeological sites. His name, recorded only in obscure notes buried in local archives, was Andreas. The boy was restless, inquisitive, unusually perceptive for his age, though his parents thought little of it at the time. On that blazing afternoon, while wandering among broken columns and sun-warmed stones, Andreas caught sight of a small group of scholars hunched over a parchment that had just been unearthed. The document was fragmented, covered in symbols no one present could fully recognize. It was not classical Greek nor Latin. Instead, it bore strange markings, lined like a code, written by a hand long lost to history. The scholars argued quietly, unable to agree on even the smallest clue. And then, from the shadows, the child stepped closer. "He is speaking of the gods of the night," Andreas whispered, pointing at the parchment with startling confidence. The men froze. No one had spoken those words aloud. The boy should not have known, he could not have known. And yet, with eyes wide as if remembering rather than guessing, Andreas continued. He described rites carried out deep inside caves, ceremonies performed not in honor of Apollo, but of darker forces tied to the underworld. He spoke of masked figures clad in bronze, of women chanting before blue flames, of symbols etched into hidden stone walls, circles woven together in ways no historian had ever recorded. At first, the adults dismissed him. "Children invent stories all the time," they said. Perhaps he had overheard stray words, perhaps his imagination was unusually vivid. But when they decided to test him, placing before him one of the most obscure sections of the parchment, their doubt gave way to dread. Andreas translated it effortlessly. His voice was calm, steady, far too assured for a child still learning to read. He corrected details the scholars themselves had overlooked, even pointing to a missing portion of text. "There was a mark here," he said, tracing the empty space with his finger. "3 curved lines. It was erased. I remember when it happened." The air grew heavy. His parents pulled him close, shaken, while the scholars exchanged glances filled with disbelief. How could a 5-year-old claim to remember the act of erasure, an act that, if true, had occurred thousands of years before his birth? That night, back in Athens, Andreas could not sleep. He sat upright in bed, eyes distant, speaking of things no child should know. He described smoke filling caverns, the pounding of drums, flickering lights on stone walls. He spoke of names, ancient and forgotten, with the ease of one recalling familiar faces. His parents listened in silence, fear crawling beneath their skin. A handful of the scholars who had witnessed the event kept private journals of what they had seen, reluctant to bring such an absurd claim before the wider academic world. Yet their notes remain, scattered and haunting. Among them, one translation recorded from Andreas's lips stood out above the rest. "When the veil is lifted, those who walked in shadow shall speak again." The phrase sounded less like a fragment of history and more like a warning or perhaps a prophecy. To the men who heard it, the sense was unmistakable, that through this boy, voices buried for millennia were straining to return. And this was only the beginning. For in the months that followed, Andreas's visions grew sharper, his words more precise, leading not only to translations but to revelations of places no living soul had seen for centuries. In the weeks that followed that strange afternoon in Delphi, the story of the boy began to circulate in whispers. His parents tried to shield him from the growing curiosity of strangers, but word spread quickly among academics and locals alike. Some dismissed the tale as exaggeration, a story twisted by the sun-drenched ruins and the imagination of adults desperate for discovery. Yet others could not forget the look in Andreas's eyes, that eerie steadiness, that sense of a memory far older than his years. The parchment itself was transferred to a secure archive in Athens, where scholars attempted painstaking translations with little progress. Their attempts, however, were soon overshadowed by the boy's strange insistence that he already knew what it said. One evening, as his father returned from work, Andreas greeted him with a small drawing made in crayon. The shapes were crude but unmistakable, 3 interwoven circles, the very same symbol mentioned in the parchment. Beneath it, the boy had drawn a dark opening like the mouth of a cave. His parents stared at it in silence. He had never seen the parchment since that day in Delphi, and yet here it was, rendered with unsettling precision by the hand of a child. Days later, Andreas spoke again of the cave. "It is close to the sea," he said. "There are voices there still waiting." He said it with the calm certainty of someone who had been there many times before. At first, his parents dismissed it as childish fantasy. But one of the scholars, who had witnessed the boy's earlier revelations, heard about this drawing. Intrigued, he sought out the family. His name was Nikos Karamanlis, a linguist who had spent years studying dialects of the ancient world. Unlike his colleagues, he was not so quick to dismiss what he had heard in Delphi. Nikos listened patiently as Andreas described the cave. Its entrance hidden by overgrown ivy, its walls carved with symbols that seemed to glow in the firelight of torches. What disturbed Nikos most was the boy's mention of water pooling inside the cavern, black as night, and the echo of chanting voices. This was not the sort of imagery a 5-year-old could conjure from thin air. There was a cadence to his words, a rhythm almost liturgical, as though Andreas were repeating something long rehearsed in another life. Nikos persuaded the family to let him accompany them on a journey to the coast near Corinth, where rocky cliffs gave way to countless hidden caves. It was a desperate idea, bordering on reckless, but the pull of the mystery was too strong. The journey took place on a sweltering August morning. The cicadas shrieked in the trees as they made their way down the rugged path. Andreas led the way with the strange confidence of someone returning to a place long familiar. His small feet skipped over stones and roots, never hesitating, as though he remembered each turn. Finally, after hours of walking, they reached a jagged opening half hidden by brush. The parents hesitated, their fear palpable, but Andreas approached without pause. "This is it," he whispered. His voice trembled slightly, but not with fear, rather with recognition. Inside, the air was damp and cool. The smell of salt water mingled with the earth, and the faint sound of dripping echoed endlessly. As they pushed deeper into the cavern, the beam of a flashlight caught something carved into the stone. Circles, interwoven, just as Andreas had drawn them. The lines were faint, eroded by centuries, but they were unmistakable. The boy stood before them, tracing the air with his finger as if redrawing what time had stolen. "They stood here," he murmured. They sang to the night and the fire burned blue. The adults exchanged horrified glances. None had spoken, none had told him of this place, and yet he was describing it as though memory itself guided him. Nikos reached for his notebook, hastily sketching the symbols. But Andreas pulled gently at his sleeve and whispered words that froze his blood. "They warned us not to forget. If we forget, they will return." The cave grew colder as he spoke, as though the walls themselves were listening. The sound of the sea outside seemed to fade, replaced by a silence so deep it pressed on the chest. The boy's eyes glazed over for a moment, as if he were staring past the cave, past the present, into something unreachable. Then, just as suddenly, he collapsed. His small body fell limp into his father's arms, and for a moment the cave was filled with panicked shouts. But when Andreas opened his eyes again, there was no fear, only exhaustion and a strange sadness, as if he had carried a weight far too heavy for his fragile frame. That night, back in their modest home, Nikos and the parents sat in silence while the boy slept. None could deny what they had seen. The cave existed, the markings were real. But what frightened them most was not the discovery itself. It was the sense that this was only the beginning, and that whatever Andreas had unlocked was not meant to be disturbed. The days following the discovery of the cave felt unreal to Andreas's parents. They had come to terms with the boy's strange ability to recite words beyond his age. But now there was tangible proof carved into the stone. They tried to convince themselves that it was all coincidence, that perhaps Andreas had simply been lucky. But the cave walls told another story, one written long before their son was born. Nikos, the linguist, could not rest. He returned to the site in secret with colleagues, carefully documenting every symbol, every marking, every trace of human hands long gone. The interwoven circles, though worn by centuries, revealed patterns not catalogued in any known script. Yet when Nikos brought the copies back to Athens, Andreas shook his head. "No," the boy murmured. "You've drawn them wrong." The lines curved inward, not outward. That's why the fire would rise. The fire would rise. The words unsettled Nikos deeply. They hinted not at language alone, but at ritual. Something performed, something dangerous. Within weeks, whispers spread across the academic community. A child, barely 5, correcting the work of trained scholars. It sounded absurd. Yet a few brave researchers traveled discreetly to meet Andreas. They came skeptical, armed with questions meant to expose trickery. Instead, they left shaken. Time and again, the boy spoke of places, objects, and rituals in details he could not have learned anywhere else. One scholar, an archaeologist named Eleni Papadopoulos, brought him a series of photographs, shards of pottery recently unearthed near Thebes, covered in faint inscriptions. Before she could explain, Andreas pointed to a fragment and whispered, "This one was mine." The room fell silent. His parents paled, while Eleni pressed him gently to explain. Andreas traced his finger along the shard, as though remembering its shape in his hands. "It was part of a bowl we used for offerings. We filled it with oil and burned it in the dark." No academic training could explain such words. Eleni left that evening unable to shake the feeling that she had spoken not with a child, but with someone impossibly old. Someone peering at the present world through the fragile body of a boy. As the weeks stretched into months, Andreas's revelations began pointing towards something more tangible. He spoke of an underground chamber hidden beneath a temple long collapsed. He described it vividly: stone steps leading downward, torches casting shadows, walls covered in writings of fire and water. To his parents' dismay, Nikos and Eleni decided to investigate. The site Andreas described matched the ruins of an abandoned sanctuary outside Corinth, overlooked for decades. When the scholars arrived, they found the remains exactly as the boy had said: crumbling stone, weeds reclaiming the once sacred ground. But the strangest detail lay in the earth itself. Beneath layers of soil and rubble, the faint outline of steps emerged, leading downward into darkness. It was no coincidence. It could not be. The boy's words had guided them to something hidden from the world for millennia. The chamber was narrow, suffocating, its air thick with the weight of centuries. On its walls were the same interwoven circles carved into the rock, this time clearer, sharper, preserved by the cool underground air. Alongside them were strange figures, half human and half shadow, etched as though in warning. And in the center of the chamber lay a broken altar, its surface scorched black, as if it had once held fire not of this world. Andreas, though not present, seemed to know the moment of discovery. That night, as he slept in his bed in Athens, he awoke suddenly trembling. His mother rushed to him, but he only whispered one phrase before drifting back into restless dreams. "They have found the place." The following morning, when Nikos and Eleni returned with photographs, Andreas studied them quietly. His small hands trembled as he pointed to the altar. "This is where they spoke the words. This is where we called them." The sentence hung in the air. "We..." His parents stared at him in horror. Did their son believe he had once been part of whatever was practiced there? Or was something far more inexplicable at work? Something linking his young soul to voices that refused to die? The chamber beneath the ruins soon became the center of hushed discussions among archaeologists. Officially, no record of it appeared in academic reports. Nikos and Eleni feared ridicule, or worse, the loss of their credibility. Yet behind closed doors, they pored over every symbol, every photograph, every note. Something in that hidden place felt less like history and more like a wound, sealed for centuries and now torn open. Andreas, though far from the site, seemed tethered to it. His sleep grew troubled. Night after night he woke drenched in sweat, whispering words in a language no one around him recognized. His mother, exhausted and terrified, swore she sometimes heard more than one voice escaping her son's lips. At times deep, resonant, not his own. At times whispering, broken, as if carried from beneath the earth itself. One night, Nikos was present when Andreas spoke. He scribbled frantically as the child, eyes closed, repeated a chant that seemed to roll like thunder through the small apartment. The words were harsh, guttural, older than Greek, yet carrying a rhythm that suggested invocation. When the boy finally fell silent, Nikos looked up, pale and trembling. "I don't know what language that was," he whispered, "but it wasn't nonsense. It had form, it had structure, it was alive." Eleni, shaken but determined, pressed forward with her research. She compared the photographs of the chamber's carvings with obscure texts buried in the archives of Athens. To her horror, she uncovered fragments describing rituals of Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, figures who had worshipped her in secrecy, in opposition to the temples of Apollo. These worshippers, the texts suggested, believed that in darkness lay truth, and that through shadow they could transcend mortality itself. When she shared this with the boy's parents, they broke down. Their child had become the vessel for words once spoken in those very chambers. And what terrified them most was not just that Andreas seemed to remember, it was that he sometimes spoke as if he had never truly left. In the weeks that followed, the boy's connection to the chamber deepened. One afternoon, while playing quietly, he drew another image in crayon, the broken altar surrounded by figures cloaked in black. But there was something else this time, a jagged tear in the ground behind the altar, dark and gaping. When his mother asked what it was, Andreas replied softly, without looking up, "That is where the voices came from. That is where they still wait." Soon after, Nikos and Eleni returned to the chamber for a more thorough exploration. They brought lights, tools, and equipment, determined to map every inch. For hours they recorded carvings, measured walls, documented details. But when they reached the altar, they noticed something strange. Behind it, partly concealed by rubble, was a fissure in the stone, narrow, deep, like a scar running through the earth. The scholars shone their lights inside. The beam disappeared into darkness. The fissure seemed to breathe, carrying with it a draught colder than the rest of the chamber. Nikos swore he heard a faint hum, a vibration rather than sound, rising from below. Eleni, unnerved, urged him to leave it undisturbed. But the discovery was undeniable. The boy had described it before they found it. That night, without anyone telling him, Andreas awoke screaming. his body convulsed, his small hands clawing at the sheets. When his father held him, the boy's voice dropped into a hollow whisper, "You should not have touched it." Now, they know. The words cut through the room like ice. His parents looked at each other with terror, realizing that whatever Nikos and Eleni had uncovered in the earth, their son had felt it. The chamber was no longer just a relic of history. It was awake. The fissure haunted their thoughts. Nikos tried to rationalize it as a geological anomaly, a crack formed by the slow shifting of stone over centuries. Yet no explanation could quiet the unease that crept into his bones. He had stood before it, felt the draft of air spilling from the dark, and for a moment believed he was staring into something more than rock. Something hollow, vast, and waiting. Back in Athens, Andreas grew weaker. His once lively demeanor dulled, his eyes heavy as though each day dragged him further away from the world of children. He spoke less of games and laughter, and more of memories his parents could scarcely bear to hear. He recalled faces shrouded in bronze masks, their hollow eyes staring through him. He described chants rising from the fissure, echoing not with one voice, but many. Most unsettling of all, he sometimes spoke in the plural. "We did this," he would say. "We lit the fire. We opened the way." His mother wept at night, terrified of what her child was becoming. A vessel not just of memory, but of something that seemed to bleed through him, using him to speak. One evening, Nikos returned to the chamber alone. He carried with him a small recording device, determined to capture the hum he swore he had heard rising from the fissure. He descended the steps, past the circles carved into the walls, until the air grew cold and heavy. He placed the device near the altar, the fissure yawning silently behind it, and waited. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, almost imperceptible, came a vibration, a resonance that deepened into a low, pulsing sound. The recorder clicked, capturing every second, but what froze Nikos in place was not the hum. It was a whisper that followed, a whisper that seemed to form words. He could not understand the language, but the cadence was the same as the chant Andreas had spoken in his sleep. Terrified, he fled the chamber, leaving the device behind. Days later, when he retrieved it, the tape contained hours of silence. Yet in the background, faint and unmistakable, were voices. Not one, not two, but dozens, layered upon one another, rising and falling as though in ritual. When Nikos played the recording for Eleni, she grew pale. "It's the same rhythm," she whispered, "the same as the boys' chants." That night, Andreas awoke again, crying out. His father rushed to him, but the child's eyes were wide, glassy, unfocused. He clutched his chest and gasped, "They are calling me back." His words left no doubt. Whatever lay beneath that fissure, it was not dormant. It had recognized him. From then on, the connection grew stronger. Lights flickered in the family's apartment at night. The boys' drawings, once colorful depictions of landscapes and animals, turned dark, scribbled caverns, twisting figures, flames of unnatural blue. Once, he drew a row of masked faces, their eyes hollow. Beneath them, he scrawled in jagged letters, "They never left." His parents begged Nikos and Eleni to stop their excavations, but the scholars were torn. They felt the weight of something monumental, something that could rewrite history. Yet in the shadows of their ambition lurked fear, fear that they were feeding a presence that was never meant to be unearthed. The turning point came one evening when Eleni visited Andreas directly. She hoped to comfort him, to see if gentle conversation might break through his nightmares. But when she asked about the fissure, the boy's demeanor changed. His small voice dropped into a tone that was not his own. "You cannot close what has already opened," he said. "The night remembers." Eleni froze, trembling as his gaze locked on hers, unblinking. For a moment she swore it was not Andreas looking back at her, but something infinitely older. Then he collapsed once more into exhaustion, leaving her shaken and pale. She left the apartment in silence, her mind racing. For the first time, she wondered whether they had stumbled not upon forgotten history, but upon a threshold. And through Andreas, something was beginning to cross. By autumn of 1983, the boy no longer seemed entirely himself. Andreas's once bright laughter had grown faint, as though muffled beneath layers of voices only he could hear. His parents moved through their days in silent dread, watching their son transform before their eyes, powerless to intervene. Nikos and Eleni, bound by both fascination and guilt, returned to the chamber again and again. Each visit yielded new details, more carvings, more fragments of ritual, more echoes in the air. Yet the fissure remained the heart of their obsession and their terror. They avoided it as one avoids a sleeping beast, yet they could not stop circling around it, as if its darkness pulled them closer with invisible hands. One night, Andreas's father awoke to a sound in the apartment, low and steady, like a hum reverberating through the walls. He stepped into the boy's room and froze. The air was icy, his breath visible in the dim glow of the lamp. Andreas sat upright in bed, his eyes closed, his lips moving. Words poured from him in the same guttural cadence Nikos had once recorded in the chamber. But there was something else, the faint smell of smoke and a soft blue glow flickering against the walls, though no fire burned. Terrified, the father shook his son awake. Andreas gasped and clutched his chest, whispering in a broken voice, "They are here, in the corners, watching." From that night onward, the family felt it too. The apartment carried a weight, an unseen presence. Shadows lingered where they should not. Whispers flitted at the edge of hearing. The fissure beneath the altar no longer belonged to a distant ruin. Somehow, impossibly, it had followed them home. Driven to desperation, Andreas's mother begged Nikos and Eleni to stop their research, but Nikos, consumed by the evidence, refused. "We are on the edge of something no one has seen for centuries," he argued, yet even he could not deny the toll it was taking. His hands shook when he held the recorder. His nights were filled with dreams of masked figures moving in silence, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Eleni, however, began to fear more than just dreams. She noticed marks appearing on her arms, faint scratches that stung in the morning light. At first she blamed the excavation, the sharp edges of stone. But one evening, after another long night of reviewing notes, she lifted her sleeve and gasped. The scratches had formed into a shape, 3 curved lines, the missing symbol Andreas had once spoken of. She wrapped her arm quickly, hiding it from Nikos, but the truth clawed at her. They had awakened something that no longer belonged to history. Andreas's visions intensified. He began speaking of a ceremony yet to come. He described torches, the scent of burning oil, the chanting of names no one had uttered in centuries. "They are waiting," he whispered to his mother, waiting for the veil to lift again. The scholars, torn between disbelief and dread, returned once more to the chamber. This time, when they stood before the fissure, they noticed something new. The hum was louder, the air colder, and etched deeper into the stone around the crack were fresh marks, lines that had not been there before, glistening as if carved only hours earlier. It was impossible, yet undeniable. When Nikos touched the stone, the hum surged, filling his bones with vibration. He recoiled, gasping. And in that moment, Andreas, miles away in Athens, collapsed in his mother's arms. His eyes rolled back, his voice hollow and unearthly. "You should not have awakened us." The fissure was no longer a relic of the past. It was alive, and through Andreas, it had found a voice. By November of 1983, the boy's fragile body seemed caught between 2 worlds. Andreas drifted in and out of strange trances, his small hands trembling as if touched by currents no one else could feel. At times he spoke clearly of ancient rites, recalling every gesture of fire and song. At others, he grew silent, staring into corners of the room as though shadows there were moving. The scholars grew restless. Nikos, pale and hollow-eyed, confessed to Eleni that he no longer dreamed of anything except the chamber. Night after night, he saw the fissure widening, a lightless wound tearing through stone, and from within it, figures climbing upward, masked, faceless, but undeniably alive. Eleni, meanwhile, could no longer conceal the scratches on her arm. They deepened into scars, the 3 curved lines now etched permanently into her skin. She swore she had not touched stone, had not injured herself. The marks appeared as if claimed by something unseen. She began to avoid mirrors, for in reflections she sometimes glimpsed faces that were not her own. Andreas's parents could bear no more. They resolved to leave Athens, to take the boy far from ruins, scholars, and shadows. Yet before they could act, Andreas spoke a sentence that froze their hearts. "You cannot leave. The night will follow." That same week, Nikos and Eleni returned to the chamber with new equipment, determined to test the depth of the fissure. They lowered a microphone, a rope, a light. The microphone picked up nothing at first, only the low hum they had come to expect. But then, as the rope sank deeper into the crack, the light began to flicker, and on the recorder came something new, a single word, repeated in a chorus of overlapping voices. Andreas's name. The scholars fled, their faces drained of blood. The fissure was not calling blindly, it was calling him. Back in Athens, the boy shivered violently at the exact moment the recording was made. His lips moved without sound. Then, as though caught in some invisible grip, he whispered, "They want me to finish what was begun." His parents clutched him desperately, but their terror only deepened when the lights in their apartment flickered and a faint smell of smoke, sweet and choking, filled the air. For a heartbeat, the glow of blue fire danced along the walls. Andreas's mother screamed, but the child's face remained calm, eerily serene. "It is almost time," he said softly. In Corinth, Nikos and Eleni made one final decision. They would return to the chamber with Andreas himself. They told no one else, convinced that if the boy was the key, he alone could explain what lay beneath. His parents, broken by fear and desperation, resisted at first. But the boy, strangely composed, placed his hand on his mother's and whispered, "I must go. It is the only way." That night, beneath a starless sky, they traveled to the ruins. The path was silent, the cicadas gone, as if nature itself recoiled. When they reached the hidden steps, Andreas walked ahead, his small figure illuminated by torchlight. The chamber awaited them, vast and suffocating. The interwoven circles glistened faintly on the walls. The fissure yawned behind the altar, breathing its cold draught. The hum was louder now, rising and falling like the pulse of something alive. Andreas stood before it, his tiny frame trembling. He raised his hands slowly, as though repeating a gesture remembered from centuries past. His voice, clear and steady, broke the silence. "They are waiting for me." And in that moment, the fissure quivered, stone groaning as if the earth itself strained to release what lay within. The chamber shuddered as Andreas stood before the fissure. Dust fell from the ceiling, the walls groaned, and the cold draught that poured from the crack deepened into a howl. Nikos and Eleni clutched their torches tighter, their faces pale in the flickering light. The boy's parents could only watch, paralyzed by dread, as their son stretched his small arms toward the altar, as if greeting something that had been waiting centuries for his return. The hum became deafening, layered with whispers that slipped into every ear. None of them could understand the words, yet the cadence was unmistakable. Ritual, invocation, a language older than history itself. Andreas's lips moved with them, his voice echoing in harmony with the unseen choir rising from the fissure. His frail body trembled, his eyes glowing with a feverish light, but his voice was steady. The veil has lifted, the fissure widened, the torchlight bent, swallowed by shadows that seemed to seep out like liquid darkness. For a heartbeat, shapes moved within, the silhouettes of figures cloaked and masked, their hollow eyes watching. A cold wind tore through the chamber, extinguishing one torch then another, until only the faint blue glow of the fissure remained. Andreas's mother screamed, rushing forward, but the boy turned to her with a strange serenity. "Do not fear. I was with them once. I will be with them again." The earth trembled, stones cracked and splintered around the altar. Nikos tried to pull Andreas back, but the child resisted with a strength unnatural for his age. His small hand reached toward the fissure, fingertips brushing the edge of stone. And then, silence. The hum ceased. The chamber froze. The fissure, which had yawned open like a wound, closed with a sudden, bone-shaking force. The altar split down the middle, and the blue glow vanished as though swallowed into nothing. Andreas collapsed into his mother's arms, limp, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a terrifying moment, they thought he was gone. But his eyes fluttered open, dull, empty, no longer carrying the strange fire that had consumed him for months. "Who are you?" his father whispered through tears. The boy blinked slowly, his small voice frail. "I don't remember." Nikos and Eleni stared at each other, their faces hollow. Whatever had spoken through Andreas seemed to be gone, or perhaps only sleeping. The fissure was sealed. The chamber, once alive with sound, now lay silent as stone. They left the ruins before dawn, carrying the boy between them. None spoke a word. Each step away from the chamber felt like retreating from something that had not been destroyed, only hidden again. In the months that followed, Andreas grew quiet. He no longer drew strange symbols, no longer spoke of voices or fire. Yet his parents noticed a shadow in his gaze, a lingering weight in his small shoulders. He lived, but he was never quite the same. The scholars locked away their notes, their photographs, their recordings. Nikos never returned to the chamber. Eleni kept her scars hidden beneath long sleeves, though in the dark she sometimes swore they burned. The story of the fissure never reached the wider world, buried in silence like the ruins themselves. And yet, whispers remained. In Delphi, in Corinth, among those who had once glimpsed the boy's unearthly certainty, the memory lingered. Had the fissure truly closed? Or had it only withdrawn, waiting once more for the right voice, the right vessel to speak again? And sometimes, when the wind howls through the mountains of Greece on moonless nights, villagers claim to hear it, a low hum rising from the earth, layered with voices long forgotten, voices waiting. If this story left you with chills and questions about the mysteries of life, memory, and the past, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Could Andreas have truly remembered a forgotten life, or did something far darker speak through him? And if you want more journeys into the unexplained, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you won't miss the next story waiting in the shadows. Until then, stay curious and beware of what may still be listening.